Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Uh, my name is Dan, as many of you may know that. But today we're going to look at some issues that are going on in our schools. In particular, we're going to look at the issue of LGBTQ issues here in our school and also throughout schools throughout the state and throughout our country. Um, I realize that this is for many, including myself, it's a difficult topic to discuss. It is one that maybe we have tried to avoid, perhaps at times, um, but at the same time, it's one we need to address, and that's what we're going to do here. Is we're going to look at this, and I realize it's a sensitive issue, but I ask that you come into it with an open mind, that you listen and provide feedback, that you have questions, that there'll be time for that. Uh, but nevertheless, hopefully you'll take something from this that will provide you a better understanding of what's going on, and that you will be aware that we have some of these issues right here in our school, and that you will be more equipped and better prepared to handle those. We're going to go through several slides. I won't go through the details in every slide. I can provide this presentation for you outside of class or outside of this presentation. But we're going to go through some of the issues, and we're going to talk about a few things in particular. I'm going to give you a few scenarios and maybe some ways you can kind of prepare yourself and things to think about. Our two main goals, and one of the things we're going to talk about really is transgender students in school. But our two main goals about this is to provide fair and appropriate education, which is something we want to do for every student who walks through this building, regardless of what they're going through. And I think it's always important to remember that we are dealing with young people. They are making choices that we oftentimes love and praise and appreciate them for, and then sometimes they make choices that we don't oftentimes approve of. And they're young, and they are going through so many different experiences right now. And so it's important for us to remember that and to never forget these two main goals right here: providing fair and appropriate education and maintaining a safe environment for all students. It's also important to know that really there are no laws or no Supreme Court cases that have decided on transgender student issues. Most of what has been provided to this point is merely guidance from administration, so to speak, of either the Obama administration or the Trump administration, the Department of Justice and Education, and sometimes these perhaps conflict, but these guidances have been provided, and we're going to kind of look at some of those and look at how they may impact some decisions we make as a school. Just a couple of definitions for you here: gender non-conforming people, persons with behaviors, appearances, or identities that are incongruent to those culturally assigned to their birth sex. Gender non-conforming individuals may refer to themselves as transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender creative, gender independent, or non-cisgender. Again, we'll talk about some more of this later. And one of the things we'll talk about is that right now, Kentucky law, when it comes to permanent records, actual records, it is the gender on your birth certificate. However, we will look at and we'll talk about, we may call a student by their preferred name. And this is what we're talking about: addressing a transgender student. We want to respect the student. We want to respect his or her parents. And we want to address the student by their preferred name and pronoun. So if you had a student, or perhaps at one time the student's name was Susan, but now wants to go by Mark, we call that student Mark. If at one time we said she or her, now we say him, his, he, that sort of thing. So we address them appropriately and as they are preferred, recognizing that that is respect for that student, and that is a way of not discriminating against that student. Um, Another thing we'll say is that, you know, just about any, I think, school and district policy says that we will not discriminate, and so we want to follow that policy, and we don't want to discriminate, race, gender, all those that are down through the line there. So this is part of that. Um, Transgender students should be protected like all students. Again, it goes back to, we want to provide a safe learning environment for all students. We want to recognize the fact that they are still young. They're still going through so many decisions. I don't want to say that it could be a phase. It may or may not be a phase, but we just want to recognize that, hey, they are a student. We want to respect that. We want to respect their preference, and that's how we're going to address them. There are some student privacy issues there that we have to be aware of and deal with. FERPA says that you're to not disclose a student's transgender status without student parent consent. It's protected as personally identifiable information. There are situations where we may or may not want to actually talk to the parent about this, about the transgender decision of the student. We need to consider safety concerns that could be taking place at home because of this. We also have to consider the student's age, elementary, middle, or high. Of course, we're dealing with high school here, so sometimes that allows us to talk with the student a little more. But we got to think about all these issues: health concerns, safety concerns, bullying, harassment. Are we doing what we can, and are we appropriately addressing and respecting this student and supporting this student? But as I said, again, official records, you can check that out on the Human Rights Campaign Kentucky website. The state has no laws or policies that facilitate a gender marker change on a driver's license or birth certificates. So there would have to be a court order that alters the name or changes the birth certificate for that permanent record to change. So right now, legally speaking, male, female, whatever it is on their birth certificate, that is what their permanent record shows. However, what we're saying and how we're showing respect, and we are trying to provide a safe learning environment and obviously defend against discrimination, we are going to address that student how they prefer at this time. Even if official records do not change, student can still be called by preferred name. So that's what we're just saying right there. And that preferred name can be used on rosters, school ID cards, etc. It just will not change on the birth certificate. Kentucky requires sex education and requires inclusive discussion of sexual orientation, and that's something that districts are not mandated to give parents a choice on that. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when it comes to sports and school activities and physical education, you get a little bit into the bathroom and the locker room issue. Transgender students should be able to participate like non-transgender students. We'll mention this here before long, but right now, when it comes to KHSAA, they have to participate as their birth certificate shows. And that generally is decided upon by a state's athletic association. So here in Kentucky, that has been the decision of the KHSAA, and we'll look at that more later. But when it comes to even we think about homecoming, prom, king and queen. We want to promote inclusion and equality, not exclusion. So if there is a preference by that student, then that's then that is the gender of which that student would be voted upon in homecoming or prom. Um, Two courts have determined that not allowing a student to take a same-sex date to a dance violates the First Amendment. So a male can bring a male, female can bring a female. Uh, that has been decided. Um, Restroom and locker room accessibility. Uh, as I mentioned earlier, states have handled this differently. Right now, Kentucky recognizes the student's gender. And so right now, whatever's on their birth certificate, that's the restroom they are supposed to be using. Um, so that's the how Kentucky has addressed it at the moment. There is a quote from that while there is no definitive national legal authority on the issue, federal courts in non-school cases have recognized a fundamental right to privacy or acknowledged the legitimacy of safety concerns in cases involving individuals undressing, using the restroom, or showering in an area to which a member of the opposite birth sex has access. So there is a recognition there. And so right now, those students are encouraged and told to use the restroom of their birth certificate gender. There has been a little bit of conflict, as we mentioned earlier, in Title IX issues and federal district court issues. The U.S. Department of Education, you can see number 2 there, Office for Civil Rights. Title IX requires transgender students to have access to locker rooms, bathrooms based on gender identity. So that's where it gets a little difficult sometimes. And that's why some states have handled it differently. But right now, we go back to what state law recognizes a student's gender as the biological birth gender. So that's something we're going to have to even continue to hash out as a school is where will that student use a locker room, bathroom. Right now, we are saying it is the birth or it is the one on their birth certificate. So here's a scenario. I wanted you just to maybe read through and discuss with those at your table. You are getting a new 9th grade transfer student. Your guidance counselor comes to you with the paperwork and informs you that the paperwork has some disparities. The enrollment papers say Robert Gonzalez, male. However, the birth certificate on all official school records say Susan Gonzalez, female. You learn that Susan is a transgender student who identifies as male but has never had an official name change. How will you handle this new student in terms of name, gender, restrooms, and locker rooms? So discuss that, and how will you handle that? What's in the best interest for all students, the culture of your school? What's the law say? Those are factors to consider. Okay, moving on. After we've discussed that scenario, moving on to, as we mentioned earlier, the KHSAA. That's the Kentucky High School Athletic Association, which is has been set up by the Kentucky Department of Education to be the governing body of athletics. It recognizes and promotes the ability of transgender student athletes to participate in interclassic sports and unlawful discrimination. They're free from this. The policy is designed to guide member school personnel as they create an environment free from discrimination and provide an equal opportunity for participation in athletics in accordance with applicable state and federal laws, rules, and regulations. For the purpose of eligibility to participate in interscholastic athletics, each student athlete shall participate according to the gender as listed on their birth certificate, unless they were legally reassigned. So that means a legal court-ordered document that's showing they have been reassigned. And then they have to show documentation of that. And then ultimately, the member school If you know anything about KHSAA, they always really turn it over to the member school. They try to, at least in most cases, responsible for making that determination. So it goes by the birth certificate. If that has changed, and they have to show documentation of that, and then ultimately the member school makes that decision. If there has been a student athlete who's undergone sex reassignment, they're eligible to compete, but there must be a few criteria, such as that must have been done before puberty, or if it was done after puberty, the following conditions must apply. You can see there the surgery has anatomical changes have been completed. The hormone therapy is ongoing, and if that stops, then the student is required to go back to their birth gender. So there are situations where if a sex reassignment has occurred, then that student can compete in their new sex according to these criteria, and then it does provide due process for any appeals on those decisions. So here's another scenario for you in your table. Bobby is a new transfer student. He wants to try out for the boys soccer team. The soccer coach sees on the physical that Bobby is actually listed as Susan and as a female. Coach goes to the athletic director to find out clarification on trying out as a male. What's the coach and the athletic director? What are they going to do? They're going to schedule a meeting with you to determine how to handle the situation. As if you were an administrator, what would you do? Do you allow Bobby to try out as male? If he makes the team, does he get to use the same locker room? Now, I do know there are schools who have had female non-transgender females who play on the football team, which is typically all male. And I've known schools that have done this even in soccer, where perhaps the school was not able to fill a girls soccer team. So they took the 2 or 3 girls that did want to play soccer and put them on the boys team. This has happened, and this is actually considered acceptable. I mean, the KHSAA does allow that. It does not allow boys to go to girls, and that's sort of a Title IX related issue. But so this is a little bit different though, because this is a transgender issue. And does Bobby use the same locker room as the other males on the soccer team? Does Bobby even get to compete? What would you do there? Okay. Just look at gender segregation in some other areas. Previously, as we mentioned, it was a Title IX violation if students did not participate with the gender with which they identify. So Title IX previously said they had whatever they identified as, they could participate in that. However, the current Department of Education in Kentucky recognized the student's gender as what's their biological and birth gender. But then let's think about dress code. Okay, when we do dress code, how are we doing our dress code? Are we promoting safety and education there? Are we discriminating within dress code? So we need to look and make sure our dress codes are gender neutral. That might be something we review as a site base, even as the student handbook team thinks about. Gender specific rules could be violated. Free expression, due process, Title IX, constitutional rights. So we need to think about those, and is our dress code discriminating against and not allowing free expression for perhaps our transgender students. Overnight trips. I know many of you take overnight trips. There is no definitive federal legal authority on the question of room assignments for transgender students. So if that transgender student, male or female, he or she wants to stay in a room, how do we assign that? Well, right now, again, the current law recognizes a student's gender as the biological birth gender. So a transgender student would stay in the room with male or female according to their birth certificate. And that's different because previously, as we said, with the previous administration, OCR allowed transgender students to sleep in rooms with self-identified sex. So that is a change. And that's something, if you are taking, school trips, overnight trips, you need to be aware of, and be sure that we talk about that with your administration, make sure that the students are aware of that as well. Let's get into just a little bit of the ethical and moral standings. Administration must make decisions regarding transgender cases. These decisions will impact students currently attending the school as well as future students. There's this idea of wicked and tame that helps leaders determine how they will frame a problem for those involved and for the community. The tame, a leader would frame and approach this issue through a management lens. Wicked, a leader would attack the problem, relying on more leadership and less management. The process of how you frame a problem often has a significant impact on the leader's actions, involvement of other constituents, and what is considered to be an effective resolution of the issue. So we're looking at this. What is the right way to handle this? Is it, and you kind of set up here two other theories: the deontological and the teleological. It's kind of, you're kind of looking at it before and after. Is it good? Is it the deontological? Pardon me. Basically, if the leader goes about it the right way in an ethically, is it just about intent of the leader, or is it about what ultimately what ends up happening at the end? If the results are morally good, then everything else was good. So based on these theories, one must examine the intent of whether the individual's actions had a moral or ethical foundation, while also examining the results of the actions to determine if they led to positive results. So perhaps it's both. The ethical and moral dilemma there is both. It's the intent and the results. And then you can see the four dimensions on what a leader does and how they do it. The ethics of the leader as a person, the ethics of the leader-follower relationship, the ethics of the process of leadership, and the ethics of what the leader does or does not do. So we got to be thinking about this from not just how's it impacting the school, and what does the law say? I mean, we want to most certainly know that, but what's our ethical and moral obligation here as an administrator, as a teacher, as a human being? How are we going to approach this? Moving on, public policy, school policy, and community involvement. What we're looking at here is when we make the policy about LGBTQ issues, transgender issues, how we're going to address them, how How are we going to make sure that we ensure that they're not being discriminated against? How we're going to ensure safe and effective school environment and education? How are those decisions and how are those policies made? Is it a top-down decision? Basically, it's just superintendent, maybe administrators, and they make a decision? Or is it one of the community where community members are genuinely heard and their voice is authentic, and it is a part of the policy? You have the authentic empowerment, which is characterized by a moral commitment, collegial relationships, shared power, and conflict resolution. And then you have bogus empowerment, where it makes people think that they are a part of the decision making, but they're not. It's insincere, and ultimately it's just top down. And we've all been a part of both of those. And I think in the end, if we're a part of the decision making process, we want to feel like our voice is genuinely being heard, and that's how we want to make this policy here. The consequence to community participation in policy making could be a policy that does not align with the vision and responsibilities of the district. But then again, you have to think about, well, whose district is it? Whose school district is it? Well, it's really a school and a district of its community, right? So perhaps everything else needs to be looked at a little bit closer. Community involvement, we have a queer theory here. When making decisions, policies, queer theorists could possibly take advantage of community input. Queer theorists challenge the predominantly heteronormative perspective that generally dominates the discussion of sex, gender, and sexuality. And then down at the bottom, queer theorists reject attempts to legislate or regulate identity and question traditional policies and procedures based solely on biology. So they spend time working to change practices and policies viewed in their heteronormative concepts of gender. And so we need to be aware of this theory that could be impact community involvement. A legal framework, in addition to considering whether a decision is ethical and moral, school leaders must also consider legal consequences that could result from their decision and policy implementation. So again, we always want to be aware of, we want to make moral and right decisions, but we also want to make sure that they are within the right legal standing. And Amendment 14 in the U.S. Constitution, is frequently cited in school law cases. It's due process and equal protection clauses. However, this does not mean that equal protection is the same as treating every student the exact same way. And courts have decided that in numerous cases over the last 100 years or so. Title IX is also something we have to be aware of. Davis versus Monroe County Board of Education, 1999. The Davis standard was developed from this case and is used to determine whether a school can be held responsible for sexual harassment in schools. So sexual harassment is not just for large and small businesses, but it also can take place in schools. And schools officials had to have actual knowledge of the harassment. And so this can relate to transgender issues, harassment of a transgender student or even a faculty member. So as administrator, we have to be aware of these and we have to address them. And we have to, if we have knowledge of them, then we have to address that. And do what we can to make sure that it doesn't continue. So here's another scenario, kind of one of our last. You are a new administrator and received a call that you are getting a transfer student to your school. This student identifies as male, but legal documentation shows the student as female. What are your first steps? How will you handle this situation? Will you have to create policies? How do you approach the staff? So that's basically what we're doing here today. We have just found out we have a transgender student coming to the school tomorrow. What are we going to do? Are we going to do things differently? Are we going to treat that student differently? Uh, do we need to create policies? What do we need to do? This is where we are right now with this. And here are some other things that you'll see in the presentation when we hand it out. Teacher preparation on LGBTQ. Some things that you might do maybe within your PLCs. You might discuss in your PLCs, and you might think about even in your classrooms. Uh, you might think about are your clubs having these discussions. I would caution you to be very careful, but you need to be aware of this, and we may need to talk about this more right here in this setting before we move into the classroom more. But this is something that is at our doorstep. It is here. It's in our school, and we got to learn to deal with this. We've got to learn to address this properly and respect all students and respect what they're going through, decisions they're making, and ultimately goes back to our first two goals there of providing a safe environment and also providing a fair education to everyone. So, thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating, and hopefully, this presentation has at least helped you become a little more aware of these issues and how you can think about them and how you can address the different LGBTQ issues that are going on in our school, other schools, and throughout our state and nation. Thank you very much.